Hey everybody, just Joey here tonight. Geo is busy with some work stuff this evening, and so I'm hopping on for a solo stream. Um, One thing that you'll probably notice, we don't have the nice setup, right? For the stream, just me and a webcam. The funny thing is, Geo and I were kind of like reverse stereotypes, right? I'm the younger one. I'm supposed to be the techno guy, and Geo's older, but no, Geo's the techno guy, and I can't do all that fancy stuff. But still going to hop on because, as they say in Hollywood, the show must go on. And today, the thing I wanted to talk about, thing I think is important, is something. So a quote that Geo and I had brought up in one of our past shows was about the definition of true Protestantism, or specifically about Protestantism and Republicanism being the pillars of America, right? Being the pillars of America's greatness, right? And I wanted to talk about that, right? Because some people might be confused because Gio and I, right, we've talked specifically about how we're not Christian nationalists and that we have, disagreements with Christian nationalism. So what did we mean then when we talk about Protestantism being part of the strength of America, right? What's the difference? So I thought we'd dive into that. For this episode, I am going to do a lot of reading. So I apologize for that because I can't put stuff on the screen, but I'm going to read it because I think it's important to the conversation. So I'm going to read the quote that Gio and I had on the show that prompted this a while back. That I explain it again, by Ellen White, a Christian writer from the 19th century. And I'm just going to read this here real quick. So it says, and this is in a history of the American Republic. It says the Christian exiles, right? So the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the Christian exiles who fled to America sought an asylum from royal oppression and priestly intolerance, and they determined to establish a government upon the broad foundation of civil and religious liberty. The Declaration of Independence set forth the great truth that all men are created equal and endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Constitution guarantees to the people the right of self-government, providing that representatives elected by the popular vote shall enact and administer the laws. Freedom of religious faith was also granted, every man being permitted to worship God according to the dictates of his conscience. Republicanism and Protestantism became the fundamental principles of the nation. These principles are the secret of its power and prosperity. The oppressed and downtrodden throughout Christendom have turned to this land with interest and hope. Millions have sought its shores, and the United States has risen to a place among the most powerful nations of the world. And so the key there that I want to see is like these Christian exiles, these people who came here, they came to America specifically for religious freedom, right? And so these were Christian exiles from predominantly Christian lands, right? Europe was a predominantly Christian place. Britain, where a lot of them came from, was the establishment of the Church of England. And then obviously there was the various Roman Catholic establishments throughout Europe. And these Christians, right, Puritans specifically, but others, Baptists and others, were persecuted by these state churches. And so these people fled. A lot of them fled to Holland, but then after a while, they made their way across to the New World. And they didn't always get religious freedom right. But luckily, right, as America was founding, this principle of religious liberty would become core to who the nation was. And I truly believe that as we look at the history, that this idea where it says Protestantism and Republicanism, right? So Republicanism being our form of government. And what I think she means by Protestantism being one of the core things is that true Protestantism, this idea of religious freedom, was born out of these Protestant immigrants to America. Another quote by the same author says, "Let us show people where we are in prophetic history and seek to arouse the spirit of true Protestantism, awakening the world to a sense of the value of the privileges of religious liberty so long enjoyed." And so I think part of what she's doing here is she's tying this idea of religious liberty to true Protestantism. And I think that's something that we should remember. And so a question I kind of posed as I was preparing for this is, what is true Protestantism that America was founded on? And I came up with two answers to this. So religious liberty, right, the doctrine, the legal doctrine, and private Christian morality, right? So in other words, both of these things were essential. I'm going to read a quote that Gio and I always love to quote on this show from our second president of the United States, John Adams. He said, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution, as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution is designed only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate for any other." And so here we see, right, that because people, conservatives, right, and small government types, right, like myself, right, we like talking about how this is a self-government, right? We like talking about freedom. But John Adams recognized that in order for a free society to still exist, right, you have to have private, Christian morality, right? You have to have self-governed people. And then another quote, and then we'll kind of flush more out. But this is from Roger Williams from the Rhode Island colony. "But who is to decide who truly fears the Lord? The magistrate, the governing power, has no power to enforce religious demands. The laws of the first table of the Ten Commandments are not regulations for a civil society or a political order. They belong to the realm of religion, not politics." Right. And so we have these two quotes from early American founders, John Adams and Roger Williams. And I think that these two principles that they go over, right? So with John Adams, that self-government, right, requires a moral people, right? Free people must be self-governing, right? And in Roger Williams, that the government has no legitimate power to enforce, right, the commands of the first four commandments, right, which are man's relationship to God, right? Because another Roger Williams quote, "Forced worship stinks in God's nostrils." So I think those are two principles of true Protestantism, right? The private personal faith, right, and a scriptural example of this, right, is when it talks about the priesthood of all believers, right, which this was a core Protestant belief, right? So the priesthood of all believers, or private faith, and and then the government not enforcing matters of religion. So a separation of church and state. So these are the two principles of true Protestantism. And then, because if you guys notice the title of this episode, right, we're talking about Protestantism being intrinsically linked to America. And I think the way that is, it's not, and I think when we explain this, it'll actually go to why Christian nationalists and a lot of these people actually get this wrong, because they want to make it explicit, right? They think if we had, if the Constitution were to say this is a Christian nation, that's what would make America a Christian nation. But that's never what has made America a Christian nation or a Protestant nation, but it's been the strength of our culture. I wanted to read a couple of quotes. And again, this episode is going to be a little bit quote heavy, but I think these quotes are important to make the point. So there's the historian, and I believe he calls himself an agnostic now, but he's certainly not a devout Christian. But Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, right, he wrote a history of the West and about how the way in which Christianity has shaped virtually everything about the modern world. So I'm gonna read these quotes, and then I'm gonna flesh what I think that has to do with how America is a Protestant nation. So the first quote by Holland says, "A myth, though, is not a lie. At its most profound, as Tolkien, that devout Catholic, always argued, a myth can be true. To be a Christian is to believe that God became man and suffered a death as terrible as any mortal has ever suffered. This is why the cross, that ancient implement of torture, remains what it has always been, the fitting symbol of the Christian revolution. It is the audacity of it, the audacity of finding in a twisted and defeated corpse the glory of the creator of the universe, that serves to explain more surely than anything else the sheer strangeness of Christianity and of the civilization to which it gave birth. Today, the power of this strangeness remains as alive as it has ever been. It is manifest in the great surge of conversions that has swept Africa and Asia over the past century, in the conviction of millions upon millions that the breath of the Spirit, like a living fire, still blows upon the world, and in Europe and North America, in the assumptions, and this is key, in the assumptions of many more millions that would never think to describe themselves as Christian. All are heirs to the same revolution, a revolution that has at its molten heart the image of a God dead on a cross. And so I think that last line there is key, where he talks about in Europe and North America, in the assumptions of many more millions who would never think to describe themselves as Christians. So in other words, the way Christianity truly permeates things is it permeates things down to the culture. Now, obviously, I'm a Christian, like, explicitly, right? I believe in the miraculous. I believe in the deity of Christ, and like I believe all those things are literally true, not just culturally. But America was shaped at its core by Christian assumptions, and specifically Protestant assumptions. And so everything in America, right, all of our arguments and our disagreements, and we're going to flesh this out a little bit more, are they're arguments or their discussions between some breed of Christian, whether it's true biblical Christianity or Christian heresy, but we're always arguing on Christian assumptions, right, in America, right, or in the West, even those who don't think that they are. And then, as before we flesh this out some more, I got another quote from Tom Holland. This is another kind of long one. To hail a religion for its compatibility with a secular society was decidedly not a neutral gesture. Secularism was no less bred of the sweep of Christian history than were Orban's barbed wire fences. Naturally, for it to function as its exponents wished it to function, this could never be admitted. The West, over the duration of its global hegemony, had become skilled in the art of repackaging Christian concepts for non-Christian audiences. A doctrine such as that of human rights was far likelier to be signed up to if its origins among the canon lawyers of medieval Europe could be kept concealed. The insistence of United Nations agencies on the antiquity and broad acceptance of the conception of the rights of man was a necessary precondition for their claim to a global rather than merely a Western jurisdiction. Secularism is in an identical manner depended on the care with which it covered its tracks. If it were to be embraced by Jews or Muslims or Hindus as a neutral holder of the ring between them and people of other faiths, then it could not afford to be seen as what it was, a concept that had little meaning outside of a Christian context. In Europe, the secular had for so long been secularized that it was easy to forget its ultimate origins. To sign up to its premises was unavoidably to become just that bit more Christian. Merkel, welcoming Muslims to Germany, was inviting them to take their place in a continent that was not remotely neutral in its understanding of religion, a continent in which the division of church and state was absolutely assumed to apply to Islam. And so the point here again that he's making is that even this idea of a secular state or secularism was born out of Christian beliefs, right? And so I think that's core to the way in which America is a Protestant nation, right? And that's why I think some Christian nationalists get it wrong, because when you make something like that explicit, something that is cultural, and you try to make it explicit through law, you almost always are going to upset the cultural thing, right? Because the cultural thing happened naturally, right? It was the natural progression of Christianity, and trying to do it explicitly through law, that's you're gonna upset the apple cart, and you're gonna have unintended consequences. Um, yeah. So I'm going to read another quote from the author that we started with real quick. Oh, sorry, lost it. Sorry. So this is commenting on Revelation chapter 13, which, by the way, I urge everyone watching or everyone who watches this to go back, reread it, right? The prophecies of Daniel and Revelation are essential for the times in which we're living. It'll bring some clarity to present news events like nothing else. So reread Daniel and Revelation. But that author that I started with, Ellen White, she says, commenting on Revelation 13, the beast with the two horns causeth, commands all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark of the beast or the number of his name. That's a direct quote from Revelation 13. The third angel's warning is, if any man worship the beast in his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. The beast mentioned in this message, whose worship is enforced by the two-horned beast, is the first or leopard-like beast of Revelation 13, the papacy. And by that, as Gio and I have constantly said, right, this is about a system of enforced worship. It's not about individuals who are lovely Christian people who happen to be Roman Catholic. But the system that we saw in the Middle Ages of enforced worship, that's what's being referred to here. The image to the beast represents that form of apostate Protestantism which will be developed when the Protestant churches shall seek the aid of the civil power for the enforcement of their dogmas. The mark of the beast still remains to be defined. And so the reason I wanted to read that quote is because here the same author who talked about how the strength of America was true Protestantism is now talking about a time and something called apostate Protestantism. And so I wanted to distinguish those two things. And I think it's important to understand Protestantism as the background, and that's why we had the Tom Holland quotes, but the background culture of America, right? Everything about America's culture, history, law, all of that was shaped by these Protestant assumptions. And America in her greatness, right? That's true Protestantism. So that's the two things that we listed from before, right? That from the John Adams quote and the Roger Williams one, right? The true Protestantism is legal religious freedom and like heartfelt religious Protestant Christian faith, right? And if you have both of those two things, America's great. But and this is what I believe apostate Protestantism kind of has two main manifestations. So the first is when it's like generally when actual Protestant people decide that because society is so bad or because the culture is getting so bad, rather than get down on our knees and pray for revival and work to evangelize and disciple the nations, we say, no, we're going to get rid of that first principle of true Protestantism, which is the legal religious liberty, because we can't have religious liberty anymore because look what it's led to. And so they seek to get rid of that. And I think we've seen rumblings of that in our society, is Christians who they rightly look at the state of society and say something has to change, but the thing that they want to change is religious freedom. And I think you lose the power of true Protestantism that made America great when you do that. But then the other kind is just actual heresy, right? The actual abridgment of true Christian faith in the people. That's the other kind. So there's two key markers of apostate Protestantism, right? The abandonment of religious liberty, and then the abandonment of true Christian faith, right? Biblical Christian faith. So I just took some notes here. I'm just going to apologize for this, but so the full spectrum, and this is the next thing I want to go over, the full spectrum of apostate Protestantism. So those on the right who want to enforce religious tyranny, right, want to enforce religious doctrine or religious, talk about Sabbatarian laws or blasphemy laws, right, Christian nationalism kind of bleeds into this sometimes, right? But just in general, they want to enforce the first four commandments, which deal with man's relationship with God, which no civil magistrate has any legitimate authority to enforce. So that's one part of apostate Protestantism. But then the other, and again, this goes to understanding that Protestantism shapes the background of American culture, right? So the other form of it is every false idea of the American left, right? Gay marriage, trans rights, socialism, environmental extremism, abortionism, feminism, all these things I actually think are Christian heresies, right? Because, listen, when the gay rights movement, did they seek to promote the kind of homosexuality that we saw in ancient Greece? No, nobody wants the kind of um, uh, sexual debauchery that we saw in ancient Greece or ancient Rome, right? Where you had older men having sex with young boys, and you had right. It was truly perverse. But today, what we see now, it's still unjust and perverse and against the natural order. But even the people arguing for gay rights are kind of making a mockery of Christian marriage, right? They're saying, okay, Christian marriage is in the idea of marriage was brought to the world by Judaism and Christianity, but mainly Christianity, was one man and one woman, right? And it was developed, right? But that was developed in Christian societies. And so today, those arguing against that, right, for like LGBTQ rights, they still model it on, well, we want it to be gay marriage, right? And so rather than arguing for the ancient pagan sexuality, they're arguing for a perversion of Christian marriage. And so again, even in that, it's a Christian heresy that we're talking about. And even this idea of trans rights or, you know, affirmative action, right, and these kind of race-based policies, even those are Christian heresies, right? In other words, it's Christianity that says we should care about the downtrodden, we should care about the marginalized. And so the left then runs with it. And Tom Holland details all this, right? But like all of these movements on the left are perversions of, or there's some version of a Christian heresy, right? They get even their desire is from Christianity. And so I think that's the other form of apostate Protestantism in America, right? It's this idea of we're going to have these social movements that are more Christian than Christians. I mean, again, I don't honestly think that's true, but that's the other form of it. So there's the two forms of apostate Protestantism we've talked about, is the religious right, or those on the right that want to enforce religious tyranny, that enforce worship because society, they say, has gotten so bad. And then those on the left that are taking the Christian virtues and perverting them. That's the other form. And then the other thing that we talked about is the fact that there is an explicit religious left, right, that also influences, that sometimes wants to influence politics in a way that is not, the traditional way of doing it in America, where we, argue for the natural law and the last 6 commandments, but enforcing worship, right? We saw that Gio talked about that article from New York Times, where you saw a bunch of religious Dems who, in the aftermath of the 24 election, they want to encourage Democrats to play into religion more, right? Which isn't an authentic expression of religious faith, but it's, hey, we're losing elections, and so let's call on religious language more, right? That's dangerous when you start using religion versus letting religion use you and change your heart, right? That's the true kind of the indwelling Christ of true religion. And I wanted to read a quote. This guy's from a Catholic, but I thought it had some I think it has an interesting application to what we're talking about the form of apostate Protestantism, which is just liberal or left heresy. Right, so gay marriage, the trans rights, all that stuff. It says, this is G.K. Chesterton. He's a Catholic, but he wrote, "The modern world is not evil. In some ways, the modern world is far too good. It is full of wild and wasted virtues. When a religious scheme is shattered," and in his view, it was scattered when Christianity was shattered at the Reformation. Obviously, I don't completely agree with that, but it is not merely the vices that are let loose. The vices are indeed let loose, and they wander and do damage, but the virtues are let loose also, and the virtues wander more wildly, and the virtues do more terrible damage. The modern world is full of the old Christian virtues gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, and their truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity, I am sorry to say, is often untruthful. Right? And so that's that version of apostate Protestantism, right, which is the perversions of American culture that have taken some Christian virtue and perverted it, right, as we saw in Tom Holland as well. So, what is the point of this conversation? I think it is essential. Listen, I believe wholeheartedly that we are living in the last days of Earth's history. I believe Jesus is about to come. Obviously, no one knows the day or the hour, but when we look at the prophetic signs and we look at the world around us, something's got to give, right? And I do believe Jesus is coming soon. And so, more important than ever is I want religious revival, right? When Gio and I, right, disagree with Christian nationalists because the way in which they go about trying to do these things, I want to be very clear. I think we want, in some sense, the same thing. We both want a Christian society. But I know that can only happen by Christ indwelling in the heart, by people choosing to worship him, and that will permeate the culture. That'll change it. And right, so the weapons of our warfare, our spiritual warfare, is prayer, praying for the Holy Spirit, and then going out there and witnessing to our friends and neighbors, trying to and preaching the gospel, which will change hearts. Right. Christ says that if I be lifted up, I will draw all men to myself. So we don't need to, enforce religious worship, right? We don't need that because the power of the gospel is the power to change our culture, right? And by the way, that power in free America has already worked wonders. We've had revivals in American history. America has risen to among the greatest nations in the world and has done great and mighty and powerful things. And so free religion, right? True Protestantism is to be worked for, it's to be prayed for, it's to be sought after, but that's never going to come from the sword of Caesar. So I think that's important to remember. So yeah, just as I leave you guys, and this was a shorter episode, but we need to pray and we need to evangelize for genuine revival, right? Preach, display acts of charity, and witness. And so in wrapping up, right, Protestantism is the culture of America, right? True Protestantism is the recognition of civil and religious liberty, right? So religious liberty and genuine biblical Christian faith in individual lives and hearts. And both of those are essential to America's greatness. But apostate Protestantism, right, is either a rejection of religious liberty in the name of fighting hedonism, or it is the loss, right? It is maybe you keep religious liberty in a legal sense, but you lose the private biblical Christian morality. And either of those two things, right? One of them is the right can sometimes be more prone to, one of them the left is more prone to, but both of those are apostate Protestantism, and they will both lead to national ruin for America. So we need true Protestantism. We need to keep working for that and standing for it. Anyway, again, shorter episode. Next week, Gio will be back and we'll, I'm sure, have a great conversation. In the meantime, stay blessed, stay true to your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and have a great evening.